Welcome everyone to G4GC's webinar on COVID-19, how philanthropy can respond to what the pandemic lays bare for girls, femmes, and gender responsive, expansive youth of color. I'm really looking forward to having a good conversation with all of you and sharing this information as we move forward. Please note that you all should be muted and should remain muted on this webinar. We are recording the webinar and we'll make it available for later viewing. Thanks again for joining. We will have an opportunity once our panelists finish sharing their slides for there to be a Q&A function. We're asking that you use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your questions, which is located at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Questions will be answered during the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you are experiencing technical difficulties at any point during this webinar, please leave a note in the chat box, or you can email info@grantmakersforgirlsofcolor.org directly, and someone will respond to your question. Thanks again for joining us. We're going to start just by, I want to start by introducing myself. I'm Monique Morris, the new and first executive director of G4GC. I'm thrilled to be in this position and to be in community with all of you. We have a lot that we're mapping and planning for the coming years, recognizing that as many of you, our first order of business has really been to explore how our young people are being impacted by COVID-19. The novel coronavirus has certainly been top of mind for the vast majority, if not all of us, in our work. And I have been paying close attention to some of the discourses that are taking place in the public domain, recognizing that much of it has excluded girls of color, femmes, and gender expansive youth of color, which is why we wanted to make sure that we hold a space for us to explore with philanthropy what some of the emergent opportunities are and critical points of engagement are at this moment. We are going to be joined today by a number of people who have been engaged in this work and who I wanted to bring into the conversation with philanthropy about how philanthropy can respond to this crisis. Folks who are working on the front lines with our young people, who are prepared to offer some very critical reflections about what those opportunities are. We have Jeanette Pai Espinosa from National Crittenden, Tanisha Wakumi Douglas from the Soul Sisters Leadership Collective, Logan Mesa from Soul Sisters Leadership Collective, and Sara Husky Mendoza from National Compadres Network. Thank you all for joining. I'm really excited to hear from you and looking forward to what we might be able to explore together and share together. So I want to start by saying, these are our girls in our community. And we've seen, we can advance the slide. We've seen, in many spaces, can you go? Yeah. We've seen in many spaces that while our dominant sort of social narrative about who's being impacted by COVID-19 has acknowledged that communities of color are impacted, we're also seeing specific spaces where our girls are uniquely impacted. In Detroit, Michigan, Skylar Herbert was the youngest fatality from the COVID-19 pandemic. And we see in New York City, J. Natalie Lasanta was the youngest. So we have a 5-year-old in Detroit and we have a 5-month-old in New York City, daughters of first responders. So that when we're talking about who is experiencing a unique impact, it really is important to recognize that the families of first responders experience this impact as well, given the highly contagious nature of this virus. It is imperative that we continue to uplift and explore how they are being impacted and to make sure that we know that and recognize that our youngest are becoming ancestors as a function of this highly contagious pandemic. Next slide. Again, our girls, our community, we see that in unique cases across the country, Black girls are experiencing a particular type of marginalization that was certainly present before the pandemic, but that becomes exacerbated by some of these conditions. We have Joviani Smith, who at 15 years old, unfortunately took her own life in California, given the social isolation and the stresses, the mental health stresses that have not been large part of the public discourses about the impact of the novel coronavirus. And then we have other forms of violence that are taking place against girls of color, where a Black girl in Kentucky was attacked by a man who wanted to police her body, wanted to police the fact that she was not in his, to his liking, social distancing on a beach with her friends. And so, we continue to see in many ways the racialized gender bias that was present prior to the pandemic being played out in real time in this critical moment as well. Next slide. It's also really important to recognize that when we're talking about our population of young people, that this is a critical moment that invites philanthropy to respond both to the urgent response needs, but also to recognize that they're situated within a sort of structural barrier of wellness and a set of conditions that have been linked to historical oppressions. We see health disparities where communities of color experience higher incidence to exposure of air pollution that exacerbates conditions that are associated with COVID-19. Again, we know that there are mental and physical health disparities that are amplified by underlying conditions that are prevalent among communities of color, the social determinants, as well as the preventable diseases that plague communities of color and that place a unique point of risk for our young people. Disproportionate incarceration and detention. The public health and safety crisis in carceral and non-secure correctional and court-ordered residential facilities that predate COVID-19 are still a concern for our girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth of color. They're at greater risk given the inability to engage in social distancing. There are issues with cleanliness that exacerbate illness, among other significant concerns. We also have to recognize that the gender-based violence that girls of color and non-binary youth of color experience with respect to childhood sexual abuse and other conditions are also at disproportionately high rates, and that continue to be a concern as we move forward in this conversation about describing the unique risk that our young people are experiencing during this pandemic. The violent victimization of trans youth of color has been documented and is particularly concerning, and that doesn't go away with this pandemic. Educational disparities. The discipline and access to digital resources and infrastructure were pre-existing conditions that produce disparate educational outcomes that are now being exacerbated by the pandemic. Unemployment and underemployment remain a concern. Each month we hear the labor stats about unemployment, and we often get a weekly update about how communities are filing for unemployment. But what we have to pay attention to are the unique risks that our girls are experiencing in this space. The labor stats from the first quarter of 2020 show that Black and Latinx teen girls ages 16 to 19 are experiencing higher unemployment rates than girls overall. The unemployment rate for girls is just under 12%, but it is about 23% for Black girls and 15% for Latinas. The housing instability and food insecurity are also continuing to be concerns. They're tied to economic conditions that underlie many of the other risks that I've named. And our essential workers, the conversations that we're having about who is essential in this pandemic is also not something that leaves our girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth of color behind. The African American Policy Forum has a phenomenal podcast titled Under the Black Light, which has been mapping the intersectional gaps in the broader narrative about these conditions. And one of the biggest takeaways that I received from listening to one of those was that in so many ways, our essential workers, folks that we're considering essential today, are simultaneously viewed as disposable, many of them people of color. And we see, from our earlier examples of the daughters of these first responders, unfortunately succumbing to the pandemic, that it impacts their health, but also that of their children. And then there are ongoing structural oppressions that manifest in anti-immigration, anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, and other forms of xenophobia that stoke racialized gender bias that negatively impacts girls of color, femmes, and gender expansive youth of color that we have to continue to keep at the center of our own conversations about what is possible. So with that, I want to say that we're dealing with an urgent crisis that is firmly situated within a broader form of structural conditions that we hope to be able to engage philanthropy in some critical considerations around what are some of the core questions that we should be asking in the field. How can we respond to those who are working on the front lines with our girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth of color, and to engage you in some of your questions. So with that, I'd like to move forward and introduce the first of our presenters, who is Jeanette. Jeanette Pai Espinosa is the president of National Crittenden. She leads the 137-year-old organization, and I'm just going to turn it over to you, Jeanette. Jeanette, I think you're muted.
I'm doing
so
it.
Okay, there you go.
Didn't have my glasses on, so I couldn't read the instructions. Thank you, Monique. I'm really, really glad to be here at this critical time. I thank you, Monique, for setting the context. I want to just push a little further in doing that. I think we've all struggled in our own ways to deal with the social isolation and instability, and of course that's true for girls and femmes and gender expansive young people. I think we are weathering it as best as we can given the context of our lives before the pandemic hit. And I think it's critical to sort of revisit that and also to recognize the social context as you referred to, Monique. I want to frame it around a social context that Dr. Gail Christopher talks about, the American fallacy of the hierarchy of human value. It's a hierarchy of human value that places girls of color at the bottom of that hierarchy, as it is also propped up by existing systems and policies, practices, and social norms. So I want to do just a snapshot. You can move to the next slide, and have us look at the pre-pandemic condition, actually one more, pre-pandemic condition through some data on adverse childhood experiences, which I hope everyone already knows about. If you don't, you can see the adverse childhood experiences. There are 10 factors in the box. This is based on a study we did actually in 2013 in 18 states where we looked at girls and boys. You'll see the asterisk by girls. That's to let you know that we're really talking about girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth, though the term here says girls. And also want to be clear that this is not a boys against girls. It's a both and, not an either or, but really just looking at the circumstances that girls face well before the pandemic hit and how it helps us to project the short-term consequences of the pandemic. You can see here, girls have a higher ACE score, generally speaking, across all of the 10 categories. I pulled out just 2 for us to look at because I think those 2 are indicative of what we're seeing girls experience currently. So you see sexual abuse and emotional neglect and the very high rates of sexual abuse that girls face and the high level of emotional neglect. So let's look at those 2 factors and look at the next slide now. So I think you can see here that the 2 impacts around those 2 ACE factors, you look at social isolation mandates that of course are heightening the risk and increasing the frequency of sexual abuse. Additional caregiving responsibilities that are being placed on girls who are in single parent homes or homes of essential workers or first responders have increased caregiving responsibilities, leaving less time and energy for their own emotional support, increasing emotional neglect, lack of time for self-care, and increasing mental health needs. And I think that is, in fact, what we're seeing, and I'll leave it to the rest of the panelists to talk about what they're seeing on the local level. I think in addition to these impacts, you see, of course, the impact and the increased needs for basic needs. But one of the things I want to emphasize is that we don't yet know what the long-term impacts are of not only the social isolation, but both the social and political and economic instability that we're headed into. So while we're here today to talk about the impacts we've seen so far, we are just beginning the journey, I think, of seeing what the impacts are on girls and gender expansive youth. If I could offer a couple questions that I hope that the philanthropic community is thinking through. I mean, I think one of them that's critical is to really think about whether your funding strategies or your priorities are working to dismantle or to support this fallacy of the hierarchy of human values, particularly in this moment of crisis. There are ways in which short-term solutions can actually deepen the marginalization and invisibility and sort of pushing folks down or keeping them down at the bottom of that hierarchy. So I think it's important for the philanthropic community to ask those questions really honestly and to be introspective. I think the other thing is to sort of shift the lens, and instead of asking why should you fund supports to either long-term or short-term to organizations that support girls and gender expansive youth, I would ask you why you're not. I would ask you to ask yourselves why you're not doing it. And if you are doing it, are you doing enough of it? Because certainly there's nothing about the short-term needs that is not also going to have long-term impact. I think in offering just a couple thoughts, as we were asked to do on investments now, I would say investing in short-term responses is very necessary. My caution and my hope is, though, that you would do that with an eye toward addressing long-term issues. I think it's been pretty clear, both in terms of the ACE data and Monique's opening statements, that these are the short-term responses are going to deepen the long-term and perhaps extend the long-term impacts. So that means if you want to give away free diapers, fine. Fund free diapers, but also fund organizations on the ground to provide some healing opportunity and to support their operation of their organizations in doing that. A short-term response that's just sort of transactional is not going to meet the needs over the long term. And I think it's really key to think about keeping organizations running, because we don't know into the future. We don't know if organizations on the ground are going to be able to do that. And I think the second is really to think about making investments in advocacy and policy and systems reform. Again, we don't know the long-term impacts of how legislation and policies and practices are going to shift over the next 18 months. They could have a beneficial effect, they could have a disastrous effect. It's really important for girls and gender responsive youth to have the opportunity to be leaders in determining what those changes are and making their needs clear, and that organizations are able to sustain themselves over the long term. I think it's critical to really understand that we're really only at the beginning of figuring out what the impacts are. So to ask organizations to forward plan, to tell you what they're going to do in 6 months is not reasonable, because we really don't, even as a society, know where we're going to be. Just one more slide and I'll close and leave it for the other panelists. You know, people have said to me, so does COVID create this sense of urgency about meeting the needs of girls? And my comment is, I think it creates an opportunity for folks to band together to make more significant contribution to support the health and justice and safety of girls and young women. I'm sharing with you here a comparison of data from 1900. This is a survey that was done in 1900 of Crittenden agencies in about 30 states. These were the issues that were bringing girls to organizations on the ground then, and they're remarkably like those of the ACEs of 2019 and 2020. So 120 years later, girls are still dealing with the same issues, and this pandemic is only exacerbating, accelerating the impact of those. That's it for me. I look forward to having some conversation and answering some questions. Thank you, Monique.
Thanks, Jeanette. Next, we have Tanisha Wakumi Douglas, who is Executive Director of the Soul Sisters Leadership Collective. Wakumi, floor is yours.
Awesome, thank you. I'm gonna start my timer. It's great to be with all of you. It's an honor to be on the call. It's an honor and a blessing to be well and alive in this moment, and sharing with you all some of what we're learning about what's happening with girls and TGNC youth of color on the ground. So next slide, please. Soul Sisters does our work in Miami and in New York City, Miami, Florida, and New York City, New York. And there are a few things that we're seeing on the ground that the pandemic is really revealing about what's happening for girls and TGNC youth of color. First, we're understanding more clearly, not more clearly, but it's just being highlighted how violence against girls and TGNC youth of color is incredibly pervasive and multidimensional. Unfortunately, the way that I've been thinking about this is that as stress levels are increasing in community and in folks' homes, girls and TGNC youth are really the punching bag in moments of stress and distress in our communities. We're seeing on the ground our young people report Dropbox links with essentially revenge porn of girls in very compromising sexual positions that's being shared widely across boroughs in New York as entertainment for young people. And so we're understanding more clearly like the digital violence and digital abuse that's going on with young people that frankly is leading young people to harm themselves. And in one case, one of our young people reported a girl had killed herself as a result of this digital violence. And so when I say multidimensional, that's what I mean. We learned through a call that Crittenden had about the changes around sex trafficking and the commercial sexual exploitation of girls. Some of our colleagues were sharing about increased demand for more just harmful sexual acts for pay. And within, I'd say a week, Jeanette, I don't think I shared this with you, within a week of hearing that on the call, one of our young people was snatched off the street by a trafficker. And so just sharing that to share how pervasive this violence is, and that girls and TGNC youth of color are often the ones having to survive this violence. And the pandemic is making that incredibly clear if it wasn't already. We want to also share that systems can't care for our girls as well as we can. And that's just a fact. Right now, we know that there are fights in the youth justice reform and advocacy movements for folks to free young people from detention because of the public health risks. And while we are also fighting to reform these facilities so that we can have the communities of care that we know that our girls deserve, so that these facilities and places can be trauma informed and healing engaged, and we can have positive youth development and all of that. We also understand that eventually young people will land back in community, and communities need to be invested in so we can hold our young people well. How are we investing in organizations and in community members to build fabric of community that can provide the essential culture of care for our young people? Also, what we're seeing on the ground is that systems folks are looking to community organizations for support in this moment. We've had systems folks reach out to us asking for what are you all doing in terms of virtual sessions, and what are you all doing in terms of X, Y, and Z, and can you help us with this and that? Which just goes to show that we need investments in community organizations that know how to work with systems involved girls and TGNC youth, because ultimately and often systems are leaning on community to provide that support in any case. We're seeing that, and again, most of the folks on this call already knew this, that economic, educational, health, and social inequities are realer than real. We have young people who are very concerned about passing their classes right now. We're offering help for them to support them in figuring out how to do virtual learning because they're concerned that their inability to do that well will make it difficult for them to pass their classes. This has to do with their access, as folks already know, to tech, to internet, et cetera. It also has to do with economic disparities around poverty that make home environments really difficult and not necessarily suited for work from home. Not everyone's home environment is suited for that. We have young people in homes that are crowded, young people in homes where they don't have space, and social inequities are showing us that girls and people who are clocked as femme often have caretaking responsibilities that their male counterparts don't have, which get in the way of them meeting their educational responsibilities. So these are some of the things that we're seeing on the ground. In terms of, I wanted to be able to share a story about how young people are engaged in community responses to harm and how beautiful and essential that is. At Soul Sisters, we train young people in restorative practices and being able to address harm and conflict in community without state intervention. And one of our young people saw a young person in her community who needed help, who was running from her home due to violence in her home, and used those very same tools to address that violence in community without the state intervention. This is incredibly important because we know right now folks are having a little bit less trust in government as they may have, and folks of color, we already had a hard time trusting government. Emergency services are slower to respond. to folks with non-COVID related needs. And so we need to be able to address harms in our community without state intervention. And we're seeing that young people are able to do that right now, and that's actually something that should give us all hope and is very exciting. We're also seeing on the ground at Soul Sisters that our young people are asking for cultural and healing and arts practices to support their mental health and wellness. They're asking for sage. They're asking for plant-based medicines. When we're doing our needs assessment calls to find out what our young people need, they're asking for herbs and art supplies. These sorts of tools are incredibly important. The healing justice work that organizations are doing is incredibly important to support, because in times like this, our young people are really relying on those tools to be able to get through this moment. And then lastly on this slide, and I'll go through the other slides really fast, I promise, Monique. Lastly on this slide, I just say if we care about TGNC youth of color, we must always be ready to attend to trauma and promote their leadership. And leadership is incredibly important because it sets up a scenario where young people are able to, young people who frankly are being asked to give care anyway, have the skills and tools and internal self-efficacy belief that they can step up in these sorts of moments to support themselves and their families. That's just incredibly important. It's also important that we, like Jeanette was saying, that we really make these long-term investments, because this is just one crisis. With the environmental degradation and with the normal volatile nature of capitalism, there may be other crises. How are we making sure we're investing in communities so that we can weather the storms as they come? Next slide. So just a couple of quick questions. What girl-centered community-based interventions for violence and harm are working and require deeper investment? That's something to consider. What role do the arts in healing justice or healing engagement play in your funding strategies? How are we making sure we're engaging the arts, not seeing it as something frou-frou that we should just like throw to the side, but understanding it as a critical intervention for wellness? And how are we removing barriers for small grassroots organizations to access funding quickly? I cannot tell you the 10 and 12 page grant reports we've had to write for $10, $15, $20,000 small funds for crisis relief. And Soul Sisters does not have its own development staff like some of these much larger nonprofit organizations. Making these applications so long and difficult to complete is promoting inequity. It means that organizations like ours that are run by people directly impacted, that are grassroots, will not have access to the funds. And last slide. What should philanthropy invest in now? Trainings for youth in restorative and transformative justice, support for folks doing work around sex trafficking and sexual exploitation of children, incredibly important work. Community-based alternatives to confinement. Again, communities hold youth better than systems can. Organizations and individuals ready to train teachers, youth workers, and agencies in trauma response. When all of this is over and youth are back in community, how are we making sure folks are ready to receive them, given what they will have gone through, the losses, the grief, etc. Healing justice and healing engagement approaches, and organizations and groups that do policy work. Thank you. That was so hard to go so fast. Thank you all. Looking forward to questions.
Thanks, Wakumi. I want to remind everyone to please submit your questions in the Q&A box. Again, it's located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit those and we'll address those later on the webinar. Next, we have Logan Mesa from the Soul Sisters Leadership Collective. Logan, the floor is yours.
Thanks for the intro. So hey everyone, my name is Logan. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm 22 years old and I'm a lead organizer and one of the co-founders of Soul Sisters Leadership Collective. And I've been organizing since the age of 17. So I've been doing this for a hot little minute. And before I begin, I just want to open on like a note of gratitude for the invitation to speak on this webinar and gratitude for y'all to actually take the time to listen to what we have to say, because this is an incredibly important conversation and it's very easy to continue to overlook the populations who have been pushed to and over the margins time and time again throughout history. And because we don't have a whole lot of time, I'm just gonna dive right in around like what this pandemic has been revealing. And I want to focus on an essential question that is, what is this revealing specifically for queer girls, trans and gender nonconforming youth of color? And for a little context, outside of Soul Sisters Leadership Collective, I'm also a founding member of the South Florida Mutual Aid Coalition. So that means that I currently have my ear to the ground for a lot of services that may be out there, and figuring out where do we need to plug in the gaps. And, you know, I've been seeing a lot of flyers about virtual programming from local nonprofits, and that's a start, right? But it doesn't address the lack of income, the lack of access to food, the lack of safety, and all of the other holes that have been exposed due to this crisis. And it's simply not enough. And that brings me to some of the key points. So folks closest to the community know best. So, you know, the folks who are doing this at a grassroots level, who oftentimes have limited capacity and limited funding, know on a deeper level what exactly needs to happen for the youth who need this aid, right? And sometimes these larger nonprofits don't have the connection to these issues to be able to help in a way that actually makes total sense. And when it comes to just kind of like leadership, queer and trans and gender nonconforming youth and just adult allies are best suited to lead. So it's very important to know that like the further removed you are from the struggle, the harder it is for you to relate to these issues. And the more that you must unlearn in terms of privilege and savior complexes to be able to aid in an authentic way that isn't self-serving. And then also looking at just kind of like how nonprofit messiness results in isolation from resources. So looking at when harm occurs in nonprofits, whether that be due to racial bias, cultural incompetence, or leadership not being connected to the youth's issues, that oftentimes means that they're not going to go to these nonprofits when they have an emergency. They're not going to go to them when they don't have food in the fridge, and they're not going to go to them when they have, like, when they're in the midst of a genuine crisis, which means that they now have to figure it out themselves. And also just need deeper relationships that are built. You know, for organizations who really are saying that their target audience and their demographic that they mainly serve is queer and non-binary and trans youth, Pride isn't the only time that you show up for community, right? Like, we need more consistency than just you having a tent, giving out some water bottles and some flyers. Like, we deserve more than that. And we need to be supported in a real authentic way. And it's also, there's this lack of being able to meet folks where they're at. So there's a lot of folks who are homeless, there's a lot of folks who are running away. And when you're disconnected from tech, you're not able to jump on these virtual sessions, you're not able to contact a case manager, you're not able to do any of those things because you literally have no walls, no roof, and no Wi-Fi, and probably no tech to be able to interact with these services. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just want to zero in on just like 2 essential questions for like philanthropy. So it's just, you know, how can philanthropy make sure that the dollars that are there are getting to grassroots organizations that are led by people who are directly impacted by the issues, who know what's best needed in times like this, in times of crisis? And how do nonprofits who are doing the harm continuing to get funded, and what is the role of philanthropy in holding nonprofits accountable to their community when harm occurs? So that doesn't mean, you know, wagging a finger and telling nonprofits that they need to be going through all of these hoops and hurdles, but to really have a genuine like accountability process where community is at the core and seeing what does it look like for nonprofits to really serve community in an authentic way. One more slide, please. Thank you. So just in terms of like, what does philanthropy need to invest in now? Need to be investing in initiatives that are created and run by folks who are most at risk, and explicitly investing in the leadership of queer, trans, and gender nonconforming youth during this time. That can look like funding laptops for remote learning and just general internet access, funding a network of therapists for telehealth, emergency cash funds for youth, so folks who may have lost their job or just who need money because their parents or their caretakers may have been laid off, paid internships that continues to create like a youth leadership development pipeline so that these youth who are directly impacted by these issues can in turn end up running the organization and continuing that like authentic approach to being able to like give back to the community. You know, and thank you for listening. My time has come to an end, but what I really want to leave y'all with is the importance of listening to queer, trans, and gender nonconforming youth of color, especially when we explicitly say who is and who isn't showing up for us authentically. And overall, it's just super important to invest in us because we live in a world that doesn't believe in us, it doesn't believe in our lives, and it doesn't believe in our brilliance. And we deserve so much more, not just for us, but for our ancestors and those who will come after us. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Logan. Ashe on so many points. Appreciate the wisdom that's being shared. Just another reminder to everyone to please submit your questions in the Q&A box. Next up, we have Sara Husky Mendoza from the National Compadres Network. And Sara, the floor is yours.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this invitation. My name is Sara Husky Mendoza. I am the daughter of Maria Elena Mendoza Madrigal and Marco Antonio Marquez Berenstein. And I'm honored to be here representing a little bit of voice from our communities. I currently live in Deneta, which is the sacred land of the Dene, the Navajo people. My husband, my children are Navajo. And currently we are the third largest red zone of COVID-19 per capita in the country. And so what I wanted just to share today, next slide, thank you. What I want to share today was a little bit about the cultural rooted leadership that exists and echo Jeanette, echo Wakumi, and thank you, Logan. Powerful messages that we're doubling down on those, and I don't have to repeat what they said because they said it so beautifully, and these are the things that we need. Next slide. What I wanted to share is that last year we went out and we asked girls in San Antonio, Texas, Maryland, Annapolis, Maryland, Cutler Rossi, California, which is near Fresno, Salinas, and we went to Detroit, Michigan to meet with our families, to meet with organizations doing the work with girls, specifically around Shinachli, which is the Rites of Passage Leadership Development Program. We're creating advocates and change makers. And so through this conversation, one of the questions that came out was, what are you, how stressed are you and what are you stressed about? And a year ago, way before COVID-19, our youth, specifically the girls that have mixed status, that are in immigration, that are also in probation, that are also dealing with single parent homes and dealing with trauma, right, childhood trauma. The ACEs, they're very much, above 7 in their score. In San Antonio, they're stressed out at 7. In Detroit, Michigan, the girls are also stressed out at a 7 out of 10. What are those stresses? And ultimately, it's really about safety at home and the conflict at home and all those factors that have already been identified, the conflict that we have at home. And so now with COVID, these girls are now at home dealing with what they're dealing with. And ultimately, we do have a powerful network. There's different quotes through my PowerPoint, which will be sent to you. Please spend some time and look at all of our numbers and all of our stories. Ultimately, the girls are asking U.S. Foundation and grant makers, what if we're not safe at home and we're having to stay home, right? And so another major stressor that I heard in this listening tour was about immigration issues. The girls in immigration, they're basically being trained daily by their parent to hold the family down, to find work. Where are you going to find food? How are you going to get the kids to school? Don't forget there's free lunch before 8. They're being trained, and these are 13 and 14-year-olds. They're being trained to take care of the family when their parent is deported. Okay, so even through COVID-19, we have ICE still working, and poor guys and women, we got to have some kind of compassion even for the workers that are being delegated to go out and arrest people and to get people and deport people. And so that becomes an additional stressor. So as Jeanette put it, these are the stressors that our girls are going through a year ago. Now we're in a pandemic, and what are the girls going through now? So that's an important question for us to consider. Next slide, please. So 2 things I wanted to talk about. Please, again, I invite you to read the PowerPoint. But 2 of the items that I really want to talk about is that we do have international conventions. We have, of course, our national agreements, right, to Beijing +5. We have the CEDAW that the United States have never ratified. This is an example of the point that I want to make. We have our beautiful Constitution, which was created shadowing, you know, the Iroquois Confederacy, which is an indigenous Native American tribe and system of keeping a civil society together. Our Constitution was created based on that. But these two tools that you see on the right are tools that young girls are not being able to utilize. These are not for her. And so we are calling this the low intensity warfare on girls. I wanted to go around, I'm currently going through radiation and I have to be really careful with my health. I wanted to go around because at every single fast food restaurant in the Four Corners, I'm calling you, today I'm in Aztec, New Mexico, near Farmington, New Mexico, next to the Navajo Nation. There are girls of color, just girls, working at the front of every store and fast food restaurant here. So this is a message to others in the community saying our girls are disposable. They're gonna be fine. And if they're not fine, there's other girls that could replace them. And that sense of oppression, discrimination, and just simply exploitation of girls is something that within the pandemic, it's going to have strong muscle and genetic memory for the next 7 generations. So we must today have some structural root changes. Right now, what we are facing is a massive pandemic on the Navajo Nation that was brought in by white Christians, you know, having you know, beautiful tent you know, masses and bringing people and infecting people. And so there is some type of genetic warfare that Native Americans that we have experienced throughout history. And it's happening again. So once again, we're stressed out. Racism is truly the one major effect. It's the most dangerous pre-existing condition that we are facing. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to share today. The pandemic is just simply making it clear to you and I of how racism is the most dangerous pre-existing condition that we are surviving today. And one of the last things I wanted to talk about was about immigration. Back to genetic warfare, back to understanding connection. We are deporting COVID positive people back to their countries as we speak. Now tell me that's not population control. So for me, one of the most important things that we must do, and this is an amazing opportunity to do it, I see the silver lining in the most beautiful way, that this is a time that we can change and have structural change. But it has to happen for us internally. It has to happen for me as an individual first. Do I walk around feeling like the earth is here for my enjoyment or for me to take care of her? And that's a question that I ask all of you that are in the positions of supporting communities, right? And all the projects and focuses that you have. If you feel that the earth is here for you to enjoy her, then this is a beautiful way to invite you to start working on yourself. Then we work on our families, we work on our communities of how we transform. And so in this PowerPoint, you have links. Please take time to read the links. There's a powerful feminist recovery plan from Hawaii that is a great starting point. So there's a lot of things in there that I don't have to repeat. But ultimately, what we need to do is go back to these structural tools that have created a beautiful place for white supremacy to flourish, where only a few benefit from our society. So I really invite us to really think outside the box. We must fund paradigm shift in our government. The Electoral College, you know, please go find out why it was invented. Please go find out who it benefits, and please go find out how that hinders true democracy. Are we a democracy, or we are an oligarchy, right? And so I just want to continue and invite you that we must prioritize refunding, you know, whoever's on your docket, go refund them from the same amount, because Jeanette said it clearly and Wakumi said it clearly. We cannot plan and figure out what we're going to do for the next 3 years if we are living in this pandemic, which we are. And so we need to be refunded equally. And this fund has to come in as general support. So please read some of my quotes. I went out, we have an amazing network of Shanashki facilitators throughout the country. We got them to respond to us and let us know what is happening on the ground. But ultimately what is happening is that girls, they have ancestral wisdom that grows within every single one of them. And we have to give them an opportunity to find her sacredness and to lead the movement for social change. We must fund women of color, girls of color-led organizations. So thank you.
Thank you, Sara. I heard from each of you just a tremendous amount of wisdom, and I extend a great deal of gratitude for you being on this webinar today. Just a couple of things that I want to echo and bring into this space before we start to address and pose some of the questions. I heard there's a basic need, to address the urgent demands, but also to make sure that those are connected to ongoing childhood traumas, to really critically examine in philanthropy if our funding strategies are actively seeking to dismantle the hierarchy that exacerbates the disparities that we highlighted. We want to keep organizations running, and we want to do so in a way that invests in the community and youth leadership that allows for the reimagination of how to respond to harms in our community. We don't want to deepen the harms. We want to actively engage in a reimagination, right? I really like that. Invest directly in grassroots and young people organizations led by people who are directly impacted by these issues, and to recognize that the pandemic revealed that, in Sara's words, the systemic racism is the most dangerous
Did we lose Monique?
Yeah, I think we did. Jeanette, do you want to?
Can the folks who are on the call who are helping with Keith, can you help us with the tech?
Yes, I'm looking into it now.
Thank you.
You all are welcome to start the Q&A portion.
Beautiful.
Okay.
All right.
So Wani, I know you were tracking the Q&A. Can you support us with lifting up questions that folks have?
Sure, I'm looking now. Okay, so one question is, I was wondering if any of your organizations are in partnership with funders who have been appropriately responsive to your community since COVID-19 took off. What have been some of the best aspects of those funder-grantee relationships?
That's a great question. Personally, if it's okay if I go first, we are funded by the Novo Foundation, and we have found a great partner and truly a partner with Ramatu there at Novo that has really heard our story and supported us in a way that is respective of the cultural aspect that we are creating in our organization. And so it's important to always be critical and to build as members of civil society, but we need to create in a way that is going to center girls, femme, and gender expansive youth. And I feel really supported. Thank you.
I think the Brooklyn Community Foundation has been awesome to Soul Sisters. They just gave us more money. They just were like, here's more. They didn't make us fill out a form. It was general operating money. It was for whatever we needed it for. And it was probably a 25-30% increase from what they had originally given us. Additionally, there's a funding partner, a new funder who was an individual woman who pulled together a fund. Her name is Haley Tecco, HALLETECCO. You all can, hey, Amy, yay, Amy from Brooklyn Community's on. But Haley is an individual woman who pulled together a fund of about $300,000, and they just wrote $10,000 checks. You applied, they wrote you a $10,000 check, and that was that. And I want to reiterate the importance of that, because I know folks have been hearing in the news about the inequities in the PPP, payroll protection loans that are happening through the federal government. Well, unfortunately, philanthropy and in the nonprofit sector, those kinds of inequities are parallel in the nonprofit world when philanthropy creates really intense hurdles to being able to access the funds. Only organizations that are large with development departments can get those funds. The smaller grassroots folks who are closer to the ground then don't have access. So that's why it's important for folks to write us the checks and trust that we know best how to support our people. Hey, Monique's back.
Hi,
Yay.
I'm back. I think, well, obviously there were some tech issues, so thanks for hanging in there and moving forward. I think I'll move forward with asking the next question. Are there funding strategies that have emerged in the past few months that have worked especially well that we can learn from? Specific examples for criminal and juvenile justice efforts would be especially helpful. Does anyone want to take that?
I think we're being quiet because there haven't been any.
There haven't been any. Okay.
No.
You know, sometimes that is, you know, part of the problem and something that might be a potential opportunity for investment.
Right.
How are you preparing as organizations for a recession, depression, and negative impacts on state and local budgets? Is there some planning that you're currently doing now? Jeanette, you raised the need for there to be investments in organizations to keep them running. Are there any specific preparation strategies that you've been involved in or can share with others?
Sure. I mean, I think we are looking at sort of a combined cost-cutting projection. In reality, given we don't really know where we're headed, right? Are we going to go back into the office ever? Are we? So where can we cut costs? How can we reimagine how we do work to actually increase our effectiveness while decreasing our overhead? We're projecting anywhere from a 25 to 35% reduction in income based on what we're seeing now in terms of funders who are saying, you know, I think the funders who are going to respond right away have responded. And I think the gap now is people who are planning or determining their own strategy, and we really can't afford to wait. So just trying to do what we can to do cost containment, look at alternative sources of funding, and also how can we be smarter? How can we work together across organizations to ensure that we're all around in a couple of years? What can we do together to band together to share administrative costs? What are some different models that will allow us to go to funders together and say, look, we all want to be here. We need to do it together. I think, as everyone has said, we need to work together. It is not, I think sometimes there's an assumption based in stereotypes that those of us in the girls movement can't work together because, you know, girls fight and girls are catty. Not true at all. I think there's a lot of opportunity for that if funders are open to it.
Mm-hmm. Other strategies anyone else wants to share?
I think ultimately it has to do with there's this compartmentalization that occurs in capitalism. We compartmentalize everything. And I think the most successful grants that we've had in the work of Shanachli specifically is when we have that general support grant and saying, you know, do what you need to do to get to this place because we're dealing with whole persons and whole families. And so just want to echo on that with some of the other panelists.
Okay. We have another one. Let's see, there's just a thank you for all the work that you're doing, which I think is an important thing to share as you know, sort of think about what is next. I have a question for you. I think, you know, when you are, actually, here's another one. A comment about general operating support that I think is important, that's shared from Greg Hodge. That says multi-year generational operating supports should become the norm. I think that's an important offering in this conversation when we talk about what is required for engaging in this work. What are your thoughts about additional ways that you know, sort of funders can provide organizational support, particularly I think that is about investing in youth leadership? I think we use terms and frameworks a lot in our work, where we'll say it's important to invest in youth leadership or in leadership that is closest to the issue, or that is reflective of the populations most directly impacted by some of these conditions. With COVID-19, we've already established that our girls and young people of color who are historically marginalized, who are part of systemic oppressions, are viewed as also disposable. And so what does that investment now mean? When we say explore leadership opportunities. Can you offer a few thoughts about the ways that funders can come together to support some of that investment in creative ways?
I have a thought. I'm also wondering, Logan, if you'll have any thoughts based on what I'm about to say. I know one thing that we're incredibly concerned about in New York is the canceling of the Summer Youth Employment Program. It's not going to be happening this year. What that means is that there will be thousands upon thousands of young people without jobs. And one of the things that they were counting on, that frankly families count on, and jobs that are meaningful, where they're gaining skills and leadership development in various fields across the city. So one thing that we're always talking about at Soul Sisters as we're developing our leadership pipeline is hiring young people and paying them to do youth work. Young people can run programs, young people can work in the office, young people can, actually that's incredibly important. There's this one story that we share that of a young person that we recently hired who, when she told people she was getting ready to work in an office, they thought that she meant this strip club called The Office, because they didn't think it was possible for her to have a job in an office. But that's actually incredibly deeply meaningful for her to have a job in an office when that's not something that is considered possible in the realm of possibility for people who look like her and the body that she's in. And so one thing that funders can consider is creating opportunities for organizations to pay youth to do work within their offices as a leadership development opportunity. I wonder, Logan, if you have any thoughts?
Yeah, and also to have that, like, the funding to be able to hire them, and also help the organization with kind of like professional development opportunities, because no matter the size and the scale of your organization, when you're bringing in someone who's like brand new to like the workforce and whatnot, there's a certain level of like training that they have to have. And then in this type of work, there's a certain level of like trauma informed lens and racial justice lens that you have to be able to do this work well. And if they don't have that, they're kind of just being kind of set up for failure, or just kind of set up for like menial tasks, like maybe like an assistant, paperwork, that type of stuff, versus actually being in the streets where they like would really just shine in their leadership. So also being able to identify leadership development opportunities for them to further their own like political and like just organizing education as well.
And
That's great.
I would just add, pay a living wage, not a token wage.
And out here on the Navajo Nation, real quick, Navajo Hopi Families COVID-19 Relief Fund is led by powerful grassroots women and girls that are at the front. So please fund this amazing relief COVID-19 fund.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank everyone for being on today. Just want to remind everyone that the recording will be made available for later viewing. We'll share that out and will be added to the website as soon as possible. I want to encourage you all to follow G4GC on social media, on Instagram and Twitter. We're G4GC_org, Facebook and LinkedIn, Grantmakers for Girls of Color. Thank my amazing panel today for sharing such deep wisdom and engagement, your commitment to this work, and the commitment of everyone that I can see as participants in this work is critical in this moment. And I just have tremendous respect and appreciation for you all. Thanks again, and we'll be in touch soon.